Good morning, Northfield. This is Ian Smith with your news for today. Water Wars has already started and the body count is already climbing. Make sure you're armed and ready for the upcoming battles. The weather this week looks good, bright and sunny with little chance of rain. Now, off to Charles Yen with an interesting report on a toxic chemical, chromium 6.
Thanks, Ian. Chromium 6. This toxin has sparked lots of controversy over the years. Its uses are abundant. However, its environmental impacts may make the substance overall more harmful than helpful.
You may be wondering what chromium-6 is all about. Well, first of all, chromium-6 is the hexavalent form of the element chromium. When hexavalent chromium is derived from the naturally occurring trivalent chromium, carcinogenic characteristics appear. This process of chromium-3 oxidizing into chromium-6 can occur naturally in soil, or it can be expedited artificially, which is what the multi-billion-dollar chromium industry does to make steel and other various alloys. Chromium-6 is also used in the production of textiles, dyes, and pigments, chrome plating and leather tanning, oil and coal combustion, stainless steel production, cement plants, industrial paint and coating manufacture are other sources of chromium emissions. Additionally, some cooling towers use chromium-6 as a rust inhibitor for submerged moving parts. Earlier I mentioned that hexavalent chromium is a carcinogen. Here's why. Chromium-6 is structurally similar to phosphate, a commonly known chemical to cells that regularly enters into a cell's membrane. When absorbed into the cell, the toxin is broken down into trivalent chromium, which has the ability to damage cell DNA. So, in essence, hexavalent chromium acts as a Trojan horse for delivering DNA-damaging chromium-3 into our cells. Do not fright. Right now the carcinogen does not pose an immediate risk to the average United States citizen, but if chromium industries continue to manufacture chromium-3 artificially at massive amounts, it will certainly begin to dangerously affect the population. The threat associated with chromium is indeed high, but the risk is considered relatively low, because of the low levels recorded in numerous studies, and due to the fact that chromium-6 eventually reverts back into chromium-3 in nature. There has been one study done that has recorded naturally occurring chromium-6 at higher levels than the World Health Organization limits for drinking water, 50 ug per liter, so there is a possibility that the risk is much higher in certain areas than anticipated. Check out the movie Erin Brockovich if you are interested in a dramatic representation of the environmental, local, and legal effects of the misuse of chromium and other carcinogens.
Chromium remains active in the soil and water for a relatively short time. Around 4 to 140 days is the half-life for chromium-6. It is extremely toxic if consumed in this time frame. There are also a lot of products that contain this toxin that are very heavily introduced into the environment. It is also released into the atmosphere when companies heat up chromium-3 to create chromium-6. This metal is then released into the air and is collected by rain and deposited into the soil and water sources. Again, this chemical is very toxic once consumed and can contaminate drinking water very easily if the seepage goes through the soil and into the watershed. Mammals seem to be the most adversely affected by this toxin because of the effects observed in studies done with rats and reports of effects with exposed humans. As a result of its DNA-altering abilities, chromium-6 is likely to induce physical effects on the subjects that are exposed to it. Certain symptoms such as runny nose, sneezing, itching, nosebleeds, ulcers, and holes in the nasal septum, kidney and liver damage, nausea, irritations of the gastrointestinal tract, stomach ulcers, convulsions, skin ulcers or allergic reactions and/or dermatitis, and even death. The approximate lethal dose of the toxic ant is 50 to 150 milligrams per kilogram in the body, but chromium-6 can be lethal in smaller doses depending on the length of exposure and the victim's medical history. Children and elderly are much more vulnerable to the toxin because of their weaker defense system against carcinogens like chromium-6. Chromium is usually synergistic with other heavy metals, but there is evidence that when combined with other contaminants, antagonistic effects result. So, what has been done so far to counter the increasing threat of chromium-6? Most of the legislation that protects us from all hazardous pollutants has been passed through the EPA. For example, the Toxic Substances Control Act, TSCA, gives the EPA the authority to require records of highly dangerous chemicals, including chromium-6. The Resource Conservation and Recovery Act takes it a step further by setting standards for proper handling, labeling, tracking, transport, and delivery of waste to where they should go, instead of into the environment. Unfortunately, chromium remains to be the metal of choice for many companies because of its inexpensive, hard-to-find properties. But there is hope in using nanotechnology to manipulate the properties of less hazardous metals like nickel and cobalt to replace it. The only challenge to this approach is convincing industries to switch to safer metals, because chromium-6 is relatively cheap. Thank you for listening, and remember to stay informed. Have a good day.